Hi, everybody. I'm Shelley Cholman, back to go over JSTOR results for British Naval Impressment. One of the most prominent authors within British Naval Impressment is Denver Brunsman. If you remember from my previous forum post, he was the one who wrote a book called The Necessary Evil. So he wrote an article in 2010 called Subjects versus Citizens. And basically what that did was it introduced the audience to a man named Samuel Dalton. And Samuel Dalton was an impressed American sailor. Dalton was brought into the British Navy in 1803 and actually continued to be impressed up through almost a decade. So British naval impressment plays heavily as far as the cause to the War of 1812, and there are very few primary resources that can be verified of men who were pressed into service. One specific one that comes to mind is a newspaper article that was published in, I believe it was 1815. And this gentleman who wrote an editorial claimed that he had been pressed and that he actually participated in the Battle of Trafalgar. However, his name does not appear in any of the congressional records or the Trafalgar rolls from that list all of the men who fought in the Battle of Trafalgar. And so part of the problem is that even if we have a primary source and someone claimed to be pressed into service or have participated in a particular event, it's really difficult to go back and actually find documentation to verify the story. So Samuel Dalton's story is really significant because it plays into that lack of primary sources, and it gives us kind of definitely a firsthand account of what impressment was like, what the experience was like. So this is not groundbreaking in terms of coming up with some new thesis or some argument, but it is pretty substantial because it gives us an additional primary source that people weren't aware existed. Another recent work, this one's a little more recent, in 2013, a work by Christopher Magra. Christopher Magra actually in 2016, and I put the citation on the slide, wrote a book called Poseidon's Curse, British Naval Impressment and the Atlantic Origins of the American Revolution. And essentially, Magra specializes in looking at naval impressment from the perspective of American sailors and from the American perspective. So a lot of times within naval impressment, historiography, historians, especially military historians, tend to kind of look at British naval impressment from the perspective of the British, and I don't want to say justifying necessarily the action of impressment, but they definitely looked at it as something that was necessary in order for the British to continue their imperial policies, or maybe it was necessary specifically because of a conflict that was going on. So Magra is different in that he focuses specifically on the American perspective. And the article he wrote, The Anti-Impressment Riots and the Origins of the Revolution, that was a precursor to the monograph that he wrote, where he essentially asserted in Poseidon's Curse that impressment played a significant role in the American Revolution, which is something that really hasn't been explored all that much. So he found a gap in the historiography and was trying to fill that. by putting forth his argument. But it's interesting in Magra's text, in the monograph, Poseidon's Curse, that he actually starts off in the introduction very strongly suggesting a correlation between impressment and the American Revolution. But then by the end and the conclusion, he kind of backs away a little bit from his more forceful argument in the beginning of the text. And so, the article that I found on JSTOR fits into that narrative where he is asserting that impressment played a role in Americans deciding to actually go to war and begin the revolution. This last article had a number of different authors: Nicholas Freichman, Claire Anderson, Lex Heerman, Heerman van Voss, and Marcus Rediker. And like Magra's, and I forgot to mention that this work also was a part of a global panel on coercive migration. The idea behind the panel was that men who were pressed into service did not obviously do so willingly, and therefore they migrated to different parts of the world based on the fact that they were pressed into service in the British Navy, and so they literally served all over the world. So this specific article examines impressment from the perspective that it was a radical action, that it was something that they tied later to mutinies that took place on British naval ships. And actually, there really weren't as many mutinies as what people might think, but that's a topic for another time. However, so this particular work does not come from the American perspective like Magra's, but it comes from the global perspective, the British perspective, and it's more of a social history than it is a military history. So you can tell by looking at the articles and the dates on the articles that I think British naval impressment is probably due for some new works, some new academic works and journals soon. As you can see, like I was saying, from the last post that I did on the dissertations as well as this one, that there really haven't been any new journal articles in the past almost 5 years. The most recent would be the one that I covered in our first forum from Dr. Dancy, and the purpose of him writing that specific article was in response to criticism that a recent monograph that he had published received from another military historian who specializes in impressment by the name of N.A.M. Roger. And so there is definitely there's gaps in the research. There's different places that historians could go in order to increase and maybe bring the narrative up to date and kind of refresh it a little bit, bring a new perspective. And there's also, in Dr. Dancy's article, he called for some kind of middle ground to be found between naval and military historians and social historians. And so really, I think that's going to be kind of the direction for future works, future studies, is that someone is going to come in and start working to fill those gaps. So have a good day.